everyone. Welcome to Briar Haus Writes. I'm Becky Parker, and today it is my distinct honor to be able to have with us a writer, poet, musician. She is the author of Sugar Fix and Heaven Was the Moon. She's also a former software developer, which I think is very fascinating. Miss Kory Wells, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much, Becky. I really appreciate you having me. And I don't know that I deserve the title musician, but I do dabble, and I will. All the other titles, I feel like I have a little bit better qualifications for, but I think it's important to do things that even we do badly sometimes, which
Maybe a
is
little bit
probably,
out
yeah,
of your comfort zone.
yeah,
Well, Kory,
exactly.
well, Kory, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a seventh generation Tennessean, and I have lived in Murfreesboro for most of my life. We moved here when I was in first grade, and so I think that a lot of my writing is very much rooted in um, the Appalachian stories of my mother and grandmother and really all my family. But also, as you alluded to, I worked in software development for years, and I really am a child of the space age, and I wanted to be an astronaut. And so I kind of hold those tensions all the time between the future and of course now even AI and all those sorts of things against the past and nostalgia and you know just a real blend. And I think we're all a real blend of things.
Well, what led to your journey in writing and becoming the Poet Laureate for Murfreesboro? That's quite a bridge between being a software developer to being a Poet Laureate.
Yeah. So my mother always encouraged my writing and expression from the time I was very, very young. We would go on what she would call field trips in the summer or even before I started school. And I still have like my first spiral bound notebook, which, she would encourage me to write a little poem about, what we had done on a particular day, that sort of thing. So I was writing from a very early age. And as I grew up in high school, particularly, and also in college for a while, I was very drawn also to math and computers. And so I was kind of doing both of those things. And those brain tests you can take about are you right-brained or left-brained and all that. I come out in the middle. I always come out right in the middle. And so I was doing all those things, but certainly in my era, it was very hard to double major in something that was so disparate. And
Mhm.
would probably still be a challenge, although I think it's a little bit more likely that students are able to do that these days. But basically, my creative stuff just got pushed out to the side as I was working on a degree in computer science and literally had a professor say to me, a computer science professor say, well, what do you want to do that stuff for? Meaning the poetry. It just wasn't supported. Um, so I pursued my career and got married and was having children and all that sort of thing. But there was this sense that something was missing.
Mhm.
And one year we had had Thanksgiving at my house, and around this big dining room table, my grandmother, who had an eighth grade education, but was really a philosopher and a writer herself, she was saying to everybody, if you could do your life over, live your life over, what would you do differently? And Becky, before it even really registered in my brain, it was coming out of my mouth, I would be a writer. And I knew in that moment it felt so true and so right that I had to start pursuing that somehow. And literally, I had a baby on my hip at that moment, a child who was four, a career, all these things. But at that point, I was like, well, how am I going to do that? Where do I have time? But I started reading with intention.
Mm.
And I spent quite a few years just reading and journaling about what I liked about a book, what I thought was effective, trying to read in a critical type way. And that was the beginning. And then when that baby who was on my hip started kindergarten, I was like, well, in theory, I should have just a little bit more time, right? And there was a continuing ed class at Middle Tennessee State that sounded interesting, and I signed up, and that just really changed the trajectory of my creative life and creative community. Um,
What does writing, and especially writing poetry, what does that mean for you? Like, how does that impact you?
I think that I almost cannot separate poetry from poetry community, because we think of writers as, this is a solo thing that we do. And certainly that's true. And whatever I write, whether it's poetry or lately a lot of creative nonfiction, or, it's been stories, a novel that's in the drawer, you know, we all need at least one of those, right? No matter what, though, it's really about sharing that work with community. And by that, I might mean just two or three trusted readers, or a room full of people, or occasionally a Zoom that has people from all over the nation on it, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But being able to share, and this sounds corny, but you're really sharing part of your heart and your soul, and you're connecting. And that's scary to do at first, but it's also some of the most rewarding things I've ever done. Again, because of the connection, not because of accolades or whatever. It's because of the connection. Does that make sense?
It does, especially because you're sharing your heart with someone who has a likeness of the
Right.
same heart. Um,
Yeah.
well, tell me, what topics are you drawn to write about?
Um, so right now, I am very much writing about the body, because mine is aging and my parents are definitely aging. And I'm helping care for them more than I've had to in the past. They're at that stage. I'm writing about travel because, I mean, I mentioned nostalgia earlier, and I'm just a really nostalgic girl. I am a romantic. And see, I'm seeing that's Big Ben on your pillow back there, right?
True.
In the background. I am just besotted by travel, by seeing a pretty picture of some place and then being able to visit that place and see what life seems to be like there. And so I've been incorporating some of my past travels, but also really examining that notion of the romance of it. And what does that mean against me living in this same place that I've lived in, more than 50 years, and a place that I have some struggles with. And I don't want to turn this political, but this conversation, but at the same time, I mean, that is part of I feel out of step with a lot of people here. And it's like, how can I have lived here this long and sometimes still feel like I don't belong? But again, that turns me back to community and the writing community and the places where I um, find a home of sorts.
Your safe space in a
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
Well, Kory, how about reading some of your work for us?
I'm going to start with a poem called Voice. And this is from my book, Sugar Fix. Voice. When she'd hand the rope to me, she could have said, "Here, jump on out of my way. I've got laundry to hang, supper to cook, a shirt to mend, this book I want to read." She'd already taught me Miss Mary Mack, those silver buttons, all the other sing-song rhymes. Now she was teaching me about metaphor, otherwise known as pretend. She could have said, "Here, this is a snake. Pretend it wants to bite you." But she was not teaching me to fear. She could have said, "Here, find someone to play tug of war." But she was not teaching me to require the presence of others. She could have said, "Here, this is how you make a noose," but she was not teaching me violence or hatred. No, my mother handed me one end of that rope, secured in a stiff knot, and said, "Here, this is a microphone. What can you sing?" Um, So again, I give my mother so much credit for always nurturing my voice, and she really did give me, one end of the jump rope, and I would follow her around, pretending to interview her on the radio or the TV, or pretending to be, the latest country star out of the late '60s or '70s. I have good memories of hauling that rope around, and it's why I still like a microphone now. This poem is also from Sugar Fix, and it's called "As the Story Goes." And I always like to share this one with fellow poets, particularly because I basically knocked off the poet Vandana Khanna, who has a similarly formatted poem that has a similar narrative. And it's the idea of taking your own origins and making a myth out of them. What are the myths of your story of birth and, your family and that sort of thing. So this is called As the Story Goes, again, after Vandana Khanna. Before I was born, in a city that loves the taste of marshmallow pies, a sign, a gypsy peddler jangling pans and fortunes, telling me to sing, to move, to grow ever restless of the same view. My mother, nourished 9 months by Burger King, on the day of my birth, ate an apple ripe as her small womb. She would need the doctor, curse his knife. My father, just back from service, all square shoulders and cleft chin, searched for the job that would keep him from us hours and holidays, swearing duty, food on the table. These facts melt warm and familiar as spun sugar on my tongue. But I started longer ago as a ship that lost its way, as the rain and muck of a wilderness trail, as the shelter of a cave, as a place called Sugar Fork, where bats at twilight once circled and swirled like Cherokee dancers, where against a sky darker than spent earth, stars float still like manna, a hope that never fell.
Dad, what a beautiful poem about lineage.
Yeah, thank you. And I really do have ancestors who came from a place called Sugar Fork, which is again part of the reason I've got the title Sugar
Sugar
Fix.
fix.
But we also really we are fans of sweets in my house and in my whole family. So it's just almost unavoidable. Um, this is one again that relates to the stories that you grow up with, and I was trying to see if there was any note I needed to say before it, but I don't think so. So this is called Untold Story. She was religious about reading aloud. Ann Lander's advice in the Free Press, Jello salad recipes in Good Housekeeping, letters and postcards from cousins, and one odd relation all the way in Australia. But neither of us ever said a word about the National Enquirer, which she'd pick up in the Winn-Dixie checkout next to the gum and chocolate bars, as if it were essential as milk and sugar. Back from the grocery on a summer afternoon, she'd start supper and I'd slip away to the overwarm sanctuary of her modest living room. Thin floral carpet, knotty pine walls, and a nubby mauve sofa where I, a sensitive and impressionable child, would spread the tabloid and kneel before it to absorb cover to cover and back again until my knees ached. The gospel of my disbelief, a moon landing hoax, an alien abduction, a two-headed motherless kitten nursing a domesticated squirrel, and of course, the secret lives of stars. What is it that makes us want to swallow a story whole, to think only one version can be true? We were not true disciples, but my grandmother tended the altar of narrative possibilities. This woman with an eighth grade education, who I never saw reading a book. So I guess how we get our outlandish stories has changed with time, right? But in my day, and I think the National Enquirer still exists, but yeah, maybe or maybe just online. I'm not sure. But anyway, but back in the day, there was, right there in the checkout, there were all your candy bars and your peanuts and your chewing gum, and then there was the National Enquirer. And Mama would just snatch that up, and I could not wait to get home and read it because my mother would not buy stuff like that. The last one I'll share here is one that relates a little bit more to what I mentioned about wanting to be an astronaut, and it's called "So Long to the Good Old Moon." And that phrase is something that I plucked out of a Life magazine, July 4th, 1969. And so that was right before the moonwalk. And that Life magazine article was kind of imagining, well, what's it going to be like once we've been on the moon? It's going to destroy the mythology, right?
Mhm.
Um, and again, back to this idea of personal mythology as well. So long to the good old moon. When I was young, I wanted to go to the moon, but I've only made it to Milwaukee, which is to say, I have learned about adjusting expectations. When I was young, I planned to move to the big city, any big city, but my hometown grew and grew in a labyrinth of commerce around me, which is to say, only certain bodies at rest tend to stay at rest. Not to mention, good urban planning is a must. When I was young, I was going to drive a Porsche 944 flat on the floor, but I've been all four-door sedans and minivans full of kids. I was not planning, and a husband I was not planning, the latter of whom came into my life wearing plaid pants, which I was definitely not planning. Which is to say, love is the unbalanced force named in Newton's first law. And I learned early on, one, to accept people as they are, even if they have no fashion sense. And two, planning will only take you so far. But love will take you everywhere, even to Milwaukee in winter. Which is to say, although I reserve the right to complain, we do what we have to do. Older now, I take uncommon pleasure simply anticipating an afternoon cappuccino from a powdered mix, which is to say, life is improbable. And if you look, you'll find a galaxy in your cup, perfect and round and spinning.
What was it like to collaborate with your musician daughter, Kelsey, on the CD Decent Pan of Cornbread?
So that was number one, a lot of fun and and really an honor that she would engage with my work at the level that was needed in order to, not just say, oh, here, I'm going to play this tune while you read,
Right.
but also to maybe bring me ideas and bring me like suggestions. Hey, you ought to write about such and such. And that's really a gift, from anybody to say, to be, engaging with your work at that level, to say, oh, to write about da da da, or I have this idea. And for that to be a collaboration, like I said, it's just really a gift. And then I always told her that I just didn't want like this thing that we were doing together to ever feel like a burden to her or like she couldn't grow in the areas that she needed to. So I tried to make it clear, like from the beginning, we're going to do this for the length of time you want to do it. But when you need to go do your own thing more, of course, she was already doing her own thing somewhat, but when you need to move on, you move on. So I think that, I mean, we still occasionally will perform together, and it's always really fun. And she has such an innate sense of timing that she makes up for my mistakes. She just gives me a really good foundation for being able to take my words and kind of help them fit into the groove of what she's doing. And it's just a joy. And it's been really fun to be able to be in some at least a little bit unexpected places and to have particularly like young people coming up and saying, wow, that's cool. And I think that blend of having music and poetry together, it gets over that hurdle. There are people who think they're not interested in poetry, whatever, and there's lots of reasons for that, right? And I think particularly as we age and into high school and college, sometimes we've been made to analyze poets and poetry that's from another time. And it's not that those things are not important. They are, that those things and those people. But sometimes contemporary stuff, I think, is more relatable. And then you add that layer of music and somebody young playing music, and all of a sudden you have a different audience. They put their guards down a little bit more. And then they're like, oh, wow. So having young people come up to us afterwards and say, that was so cool, is really nice to have thought that maybe we opened a door for some, towards poetry and self-expression, creative expression.
Well, are there any times where you might find a challenge in your writing? And if you do have challenges, how do you overcome them?
Hmm. Um, yeah, I think that certainly there are challenges. I think there are challenges to just showing up all the time and writing. And for me, I think I have a pretty big sensor on my shoulder about, what's okay to write about and what's not okay to write about. And like I say, especially when you have so many family stories and things as you age that you're experiencing more and more, and you're like, well, do I really want to expose that or not in any
Hmm.
in any kind of form? And so one thing I have to remind myself is that it's okay to write anything. And it is okay to share whatever that is with at least a limited audience. And I have to believe in that having its own purpose right there, full stop. Then it's a different decision whether to keep taking it further and sharing it with the world and seeing how that falls out. One thing I've learned from like my book being used in a few classrooms that I'm aware of, and occasionally there'll be a teacher who shares with me some responses to a poem or whatever in, a college classroom. And sometimes the students are really getting what I hoped they might from a given poem. Sometimes they are not. They are not seeing everything. And it's really made me have an appreciation for you just don't know how your work's going to land. You don't. That's part of it being creative, and that's okay. But it is something that for me, I still have to keep in mind. And like I said, though, the key is going back to the beginning and not censoring out stuff just to start with. Because if it needs to be said, if I need to say it, then I need to get it down. And then I can decide later what I want to do with that. And then I think the other side of that would be in generating work. On the far other end of the spectrum, I have trouble getting work all the way done so that it can go out the door. And that is, I think, for me, sometimes an issue of time. And everything I'm juggling, as it would be for many of us. And sometimes I have to be honest and say, my gosh, revision is hard work, right? Very hard work. And sometimes it's easier just to show up for the generative stuff, have a little fun and go, oh yeah, that's not ready. And then it disappears into some notebook or, drive in the cloud, and I'll come across it much later and say, oh my goodness, why haven't I worked on this? And so I think there's some discipline that you have to have. And I mean, I do keep spreadsheets and I use Scrivener, which helps me kind of keep poems, particularly or shorter pieces, more at least if they're in there, then I'm going to see them and maybe remember a little bit better to come back to them other than them just getting lost in the cloud somewhere. So
Do you ever find that some
that's
of your poetry actually
I don't
works
know.
as stories?
Yeah. I'm so narrative in style. And therefore, absolutely, I think that that's every poem I write is really almost a story. I I have tried to break out of that just because I think it's good for us to test what we naturally do and push against that. But it's just my natural mode. And to be honest, I mean, a lot of the like flash nonfiction that I'm writing right now, I'm not sure if it's really a prose poem or a flash story. And I mean, I'm in a group with some other people who will also kind of shrug and say, I don't know, you know, how important is that? I'm not sure. And I'm sure there are people who would have a better handle on that than I do, but um, I just send it out both ways and see what sticks.
Do you have, you mentioned that you have a group that you talk to. Would you recommend to burgeoning writers that they have some type of critique group to belong to?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, again, for me, it comes back to community. It comes to investing in one another, paying deep attention to one another, the gift that involves. But also, maybe more than any other discipline, I always wondered this because I don't really fully exist in any other artistic discipline. Even if I play a little bit of music, it's not the same. But, this idea of how our work is landing and how we separate what we're trying to do in our head versus what we are actually accomplishing on the page, that's hard to do. And it does take some other eyes on it, eyes and ears. Although I also really, really highly recommend always reading your work aloud to yourself, to start with. I think that's really important as well. Um, but but yeah, cultivating that group of people who you trust and who you are willing to also invest in their work is invaluable.
Well, Corey, what would you want your legacy to be in 200 years when people are going back and they're reviewing the work of Corey Wells? What would you like for them to see?
So I struggle with this a lot because honestly, when I started out writing when I was young, I thought, oh, I'm going to be able to write like a great Southern novel. I didn't want a great American novel, but a great Southern novel would be wonderful. And as I mentioned, I have a novel in the drawer. Um, I am the minorest of minor poets, really. And I think that my legacy, if I have one at all, is number one, that I'm just this little window into time and into the particular, again, time that I have lived, to be that blend of tradition and this particularly Appalachian tradition, and then again of age in the space age and putting these things together. So maybe I'm a little window into that, but more importantly, and for me, way more importantly, it's the work that I do to encourage others. and it's running poetry in the borough. It's really everything that I do as a mostly volunteer arts administrator now, I think is my real legacy because if I'm encouraging other people to be able to claim their voice and to have a safe space and and to celebrate um, being together in a creative community, hands down, I have to choose that.
Good answer. I think, Kory, that you have made such an impact in the literary world, and you think it's just Murfreesboro, but it's everywhere. Especially with the amazing ability that we have now with Zoom, you can literally impact someone around the world. So
Yeah, this
I
is
thank you
true.
so much for being a part of Briar Haus Writes today, and I wish you all the best in your literary future.
Well, thank you, Becky, and I appreciate you cultivating this particular space for anyone who can find it. And I really appreciate you sharing a little bit of my story and my work.